Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 16th lecture in our course on brain and behavior. And in this section, we're going to talk about psychoactive drugs. Last time we talked about psychoactive drugs in general, and this time we're going to go specific. We're going to look at particular categories, how they affect neurons, how they affect the brain, how they affect behavior and psychological experience. So that's going to be this unit, getting into the specifics now that we've laid our foundation for how drugs work in general. So what we're going to do is look at these individual categories. And as we'll see, drugs do fall into categories. We'll talk about why we categorize things the way we do. And again, we'll look at how they affect neurons and the brain. So we've already done our unit on the action potentials and our unit on synaptic transmission. And that second one is particularly important for understanding psychoactive drugs. That's why the units are ordered the way they are. In order to understand how psychoactive drugs work, you need to know about neurotransmitters. You need to know about the stages of synaptic transmission. And once we can connect neurotransmitters to certain brain systems, certain kinds of behavior, then it starts to make sense why particular categories of drugs have the effects that they do on both the brain and on behavior. And we'll talk about the consequences of use, both short-term and long-term for certain drugs. We're not going to go in depth for every single drug that we talk about. We're going to pick some examples. And they're good examples insofar as they affect particular neurotransmitter systems, that we understand them pretty well, and we know what behaviors they produce. So we'll also take a look at a little bit of history. So psychoactive drugs have an interesting history. Many of them are naturally occurring. Not all of them. Some are synthetic. Those have an interesting history as well, but just not as long. So we'll see how big an impact psychoactive drugs have and have had on society, on the world, on the economy. And we'll see how neurotransmitters mediate the effect of psychoactive drugs, that when a psychoactive drug elevates or decreases the effective level of a neurotransmitter, why that produces certain neural and behavioral effects. And we'll look at the effects, we'll look at risks, and we'll compare and contrast here. So some categories of drugs represent a higher level of risk for dependence, a higher risk for overdose, for example. And of course they have different effects, but the risks from one category to the next can change. And then again, we'll go in depth. We're going to pick a few examples, primarily one big example from each class, and go in depth on it. So we'll do that so we have a feel for what these drugs do, what these chemicals do, and how they affect the brain. Okay, so we will start with the stimulants. And stimulants are drugs that increase neural excitability. So we're about to see the other category of depressants, which sound like they cause the psychological disorder of depression, or at least that they affect mood, that they depress you in some way. That's not what these terms mean. Stimulants and depressants refer to their effects at the neural level. So stimulants increase neural activity, depressants decrease neural activity. So we'll start with the stimulants, and we'll start with nicotine. Nicotine is a pretty famous one. Some sources make nicotine its own category as opposed to a stimulant. Your book refers to it as a stimulant. I'm fine with that, so we'll go with it. Incidentally, this is the discoverer of nicotine, Jean Nicot. And what nicotine is most famous for coming from, of course, is the tobacco plant, Nicotiana tabacum. And there are a couple different species of tobacco plant, but they evolved the chemical of nicotine and included in their leaves as a measure against pests. So insects that eat tobacco leaves will overdose. They will have too much nicotine in their system and they will die. Now, of course, that is unlikely for humans, but that is why the chemical nicotine exists. And in fact, nicotine solution can still be used as a pesticide. Anyway, so historically, tobacco obviously economically important and has a long history of cultivation by humans. But nicotine itself comes from the tobacco plant. And of course, in our current society, the most common way to bring nicotine into the body is through smoking, usually cigarette smoking. There's increasingly a trend toward vaping using electronic cigarettes, but historically, this was not the most common way to use tobacco. Chewing tobacco, for example, or snuff, were both common ways to introduce nicotine to the body. Now, cigarette smoking is the most common way, but it wasn't always the case. And so nicotine does multiple things. Its primary mechanism of action is through activation of the acetylcholine receptors. As we'll see in a moment, there are actual acetylcholine receptors that are named after nicotine because that's how they were discovered. Nicotine also acts as a norepinephrine agonist. So it increases norepinephrine levels and it activates the sympathetic nervous system. And we'll see that's something that stimulants tend to have in common. They activate the norepinephrine system. They activate that fight or flight response. And so you get elevated heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased breathing rate. It also tends to shut down digestion, which is why tobacco use tends to also act as an appetite suppressant. If you become dependent on tobacco and then you stop using it, you will often experience weight gain due to appetite increase. Anyway, acetylcholine is the main target of nicotine, and so nicotine actually has some cognitive effects. It enhances memory to a certain degree. That is not advocating for its use, of course. At higher doses, nicotine can actually cause the release of chemicals called endorphins. And endorphins are neurotransmitters that suppress pain. And they're actually one of the molecules that opioids, pain-killing agents, can mimic. But if you've ever heard of a runner's high, for example, what that often is endorphin release. So a decreased sensation of pain after exertion. And it has to do with the fight or flight response. But anyway, you ingest enough nicotine, you will experience endorphin release. It also seems to have some effect on the dopamine system. We think that's one reason that nicotine is at such a high risk for dependence. It's very easy to become dependent upon nicotine after prolonged use. And that's another theme we'll see throughout today, is that drugs that affect the dopamine system and increase dopamine levels tend to be more addictive. And so there are, as I mentioned, actual acetylcholine receptors that are called nicotinic because that's what nicotine binds to. So nicotine is a direct agonist of these acetylcholine receptors. They evolved to respond to acetylcholine, but they also respond to nicotine. These happen to be ionotropic channels, as we'll see. And that's just one of the two receptor types that acetylcholine has. So we have nicotinic receptors, which are ionotropic. That is, they act very quickly. Nicotine binds to those. And there are also muscarinic receptors, which are metabotropic. So the more slow-acting, longer-lasting form of receptor. We're not going to go into the muscarinic receptors. They're activated by a chemical called muscarine. I'm not going to go into it, but you have both basic kinds of receptor. And this is a drug called Aricept. And Aricept is used to treat the symptoms that are related to memory for Alzheimer's disease. It doesn't cure the disease. It just improves memory in many patients. What Aricept does is it's what's called an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. Acetylcholinesterase is an enzyme in the synaptic cleft that breaks down acetylcholine. This drug inhibits that enzyme, so acetylcholine does not get broken down very easily. It stays out in the cleft longer. So Aricept is an acetylcholine agonist. It prevents the breakdown of acetylcholine, keeps it in the cleft, and enhances acetylcholine activity, which, as it turns out, improves memory in many of these patients. Again, it doesn't cure the underlying disease. It's just elevating acetylcholine levels in the central nervous system. Because acetylcholine is involved in memory. You find a lot of acetylcholine neurons in the hippocampus. But of course, acetylcholine is also found at the neuromuscular junction. So in order to contract your muscles, you need to release acetylcholine. And this makes it a common target for toxins as well, both naturally occurring toxins that have evolved and also man-made ones. So as I already mentioned, nicotine evolved as a pesticide. And this is a clip from the movie The Rock, which features another acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. Nicolas Cage's character describes it. He just calls it a cholinesterase inhibitor. He leaves off the acetyl, same thing. But he describes some of the symptoms, and some of these are exaggerated, but more or less this is what an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor, if it's very potent, can do.
And what exactly does this stuff do?
If the rocket renders it aerosol, it can take out the entire city of people.
Really? And what happens if you drop one?
Happily, it'll just wipe out you and me.
How?
It's a cholinesterase inhibitor. Stops the brain from sending nerve messages down the spinal cord within 30 seconds. Any epidermal exposure or inhalation, and you'll know. Twinge at the small of your back as the poison seizes your nervous system. Do not move that! Your muscles freeze, you can't breathe. You spasm so hard you break your own back and spit your guts out. But that's after your skin melts off.
Oh my God.
Okay, so some of that is exaggerated, but a lot of it is fairly accurate. You talk about convulsions. That is something that an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor can do. And again, it's a target for toxins, both synthetic and naturally occurring. And by elevating acetylcholine levels to dangerous amounts, you're constantly contracting the muscles. And that's one of the symptoms that's mentioned in that clip, is you have convulsions, strong muscular contractions. And so that's what happens if acetylcholine levels are too high. Because the muscles are constantly contracted, you also can't breathe. But you can also have the opposite problem. If you can't contract muscles enough, then you've got paralysis in sort of the opposite sense, where instead of contracting everything, you can't contract anything at all, but both are potentially lethal. So if you've heard of Socrates, Socrates was publicly executed by ingesting a poison called hemlock. And what hemlock does is it acts as an acetylcholine antagonist. What we talked about so far have been agonists, but an acetylcholine antagonist inhibits the activity of acetylcholine, blocks those receptors, and it is just as lethal. Instead of contracting everything at once, you can't contract any muscles. And you need to be able to alternatively contract and relax muscles in order to breathe. So both effects are potentially lethal, but both effects are muscular in nature, which is why acetylcholine is such a common target for poisons. Another stimulant is cocaine. So cocaine is naturally occurring. It's derived from the coca plant. So in the Andes Mountains, these coca plants occur naturally. And so native tribes there for centuries have known that they can chew on these leaves and get a boost of energy, for example. It wasn't until the 1800s that we were able to isolate cocaine chemically and put it in a far more powerful form. And that's really when it became far more dangerous. And so that chemical isolation depended on our knowledge of chemistry, and that's something that took a while for us to develop. So in its original form of usage, cocaine was low concentration. Its effects were noticeable, but not promoting dependence, and certainly not lethal. And so that's one of the drugs that has an interesting history. We have its natural occurrence, we have its use from its natural form, but then we have chemical isolation. And while that makes it easier to control in terms of dosage, it makes it easier to transport, it also means that a person can take a far higher concentration, and that's usually when you're at a much higher risk for dependence, is when you're getting a concentrated dose. If you've heard of what you might think of as an urban myth that Coca-Cola contained cocaine, that is true. Coca-Cola started off as what we call a patent medicine. It was a tonic or an elixir. It was supposed to improve health or make you feel better. And Coca-Cola did contain cocaine. It also contained caffeine, and it still does in its caffeinated forms. But cocaine was in there, so you had two different stimulants in Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola no longer contains cocaine, though it may contain other compounds from the coca leaf. The actual recipe is a very closely guarded secret, so we don't know exactly what's in there, but we know it's not cocaine. And Sigmund Freud, one of the most famous, if not the most famous psychologist in history, was very excited about cocaine, promoted its use, thought it was a great way to get rid of morphine addiction. It wasn't until later it was discovered that cocaine itself can produce dependence, and Freud had to change his thinking about how useful a drug cocaine was. And that's another common theme, is that we often discover the negative effects of a drug well after we notice the positive ones. So cocaine is what we call a triple reuptake inhibitor. We know what reuptake is. It's the process by which neurotransmitters are pulled back into the presynaptic neuron. And the triple part is that it affects 3 different neurotransmitters. So for example, it inhibits reuptake of serotonin. So it leaves serotonin out in the cleft for longer. It's an agonist. It's an agonist for all 3 of these neurotransmitters. And that's why in high doses, cocaine can elevate body temperature to dangerous levels. It also increases dopamine levels by inhibiting reuptake. And when a drug does this, when it elevates dopamine levels, one of the symptoms that's common is euphoria, that high, as it's often referred to, an extremely good feeling. And then there's also the sense of alertness and wakefulness that is produced by cocaine. And that's because norepinephrine is also affected. If you don't pull norepinephrine back into the presynaptic neuron, it's out in the cleft longer, and it has the effects that norepinephrine normally has. And that, of course, one of them is to affect the fight or flight system, our sympathetic nervous system. And so by activating the sympathetic nervous system, you get increased arousal, you get increased heart rate, pupil dilation, all the effects that you normally get in our fight or flight response. Cocaine is also highly addictive, mainly because of the dopamine component, we think. And that's another common theme, is that drugs that affect the dopamine system tend to lead to a much higher risk of dependence. Later on, toward the end today, we'll get to hallucinogens. Hallucinogens don't generally affect dopamine, and they tend also to not be at a very high risk for dependence. Not so for the stimulants. The stimulants tend to be associated with a high risk for dependence. Cocaine is a good example. Cocaine is also toxic. Its most common form is cocaine hydrochloride. You don't need to memorize that part. But that powder we see in the upper right here is cocaine hydrochloride. When it mixes with predominantly water in your body, it turns into cocaine and hydrochloric acid. And so cocaine itself, in high enough concentrations, will be lethal, but also its byproducts are toxic. It can erode tissue. Interestingly, cocaine actually has legitimate medical use. Freud thought that it had more uses than it really does. But it can also be used as an anesthetic. It has to be a local anesthetic. In high enough doses, when put on the skin or the surface of the body, it actually inhibits sodium channels. It prevents action potentials from occurring. And anything that prevents action potentials from occurring can act as an anesthetic. Now, the reason it has to be local is that if you ingest it in high enough concentration for it to act as a general anesthetic, it would be lethal. So it's only used as a topical anesthetic, mainly for things like ophthalmological surgeries, eye surgery. So it still has some legitimate medical use. It's not very common, but it has a licensed medical use. Other than that, it has an interesting history, but because of the severity of its effects, it is highly addictive and it can be very harmful. Another stimulant that's far less harmful is caffeine. It is probably the most popular of the psychoactive drugs. It's most famously included in coffee. We see here the coffee bean, which is technically not a bean, it's a berry, but let it go. The coffee bean contains caffeine, and so when brewed into coffee, the liquid will contain caffeine, and that will obviously go into the body. But other things that we ingest contain caffeine as well. Tea is a famous one. Here we have a cocoa pod. Chocolate contains caffeine as well. not nearly in the concentration that coffee does, but it contains a little. And your body has what are called adenosine receptors. And so these are receptors in the brain, and when you activate them, they do things like decrease heart rate. They are a vasodilator, which means they open up blood vessels. They decrease neural activity. And you might think, well, what's happening then? How is caffeine related to this? Because caffeine does the opposite of all those things. Well, caffeine inhibits these adenosine receptors. So by inhibiting those receptors, by acting as an adenosine antagonist, you increase heart rate, you constrict blood vessels, you increase neural activity. And of course, that's what a stimulant does. It increases neural activity. So caffeine is unusual in that it doesn't act on any of the famous neurotransmitters that we already know. Instead, it inhibits adenosine receptors. And by acting as an adenosine antagonist, it has all of its stimulant effects. And there's some question as to whether caffeine can actually lead to dependence. People might colloquially say, oh, I'm addicted to coffee. They're almost certainly not literally addicted to coffee, certainly not in a physiological way. And they might have a psychological dependence on caffeine. But cases of literal physiological caffeine dependence are very rare, as are overdoses. It is technically possible to overdose on caffeine, but it takes a very high concentrated dose. So that's one of the health effects. In more moderate, sort of typical dosages, there's some interesting data on caffeine. So drinking a lot of caffeine seems to be harmful for your cardiovascular system. But it seems also that drinking a little bit, we're talking about 2 to 3 cups of coffee a day, might actually be a little bit beneficial. That is, drinking 2 to 3 cups of coffee a day might provide more cardiovascular benefit than drinking no coffee at all. This is still a little bit controversial, but it's worth mentioning. You may have heard this in the news. So caffeine is more or less benign. It doesn't really do much. Again, in extreme doses, you can have an overdose or affect your cardiovascular system in a negative way, but generally, caffeine is pretty innocuous. Amphetamine is another stimulant. So we see its chemical structure here, and the point here is not to memorize the chemical structure of amphetamine, but we're going to see molecules that are similar to amphetamine. Amphetamine is synthetic. It is similar to some naturally occurring substances, but it was first synthesized in the 20th century. And it's similar to cocaine in terms of its targets, that is the neurotransmitters. So we have dopamine, norepinephrine, not so much serotonin. Its mechanism of action is very different. It's more complex. We're not going to go into it. But it does elevate the levels of these neurotransmitters. So you get things like euphoria, increased alertness. And that increased alertness or wakefulness is why amphetamine was developed in the first place, activating the sympathetic nervous system, keeping people awake. So you get increased alertness. You also get euphoria. And of course, amphetamines and related compounds are famous now as medications for things like attention deficit disorder. And so the drug Ritalin or Adderall, famous for promoting attention. And one of the things that norepinephrine does is control your attentional process. And it might seem a little counterintuitive that a stimulant that increases wakefulness and even agitation or anxiety would help with hyperactivity, and it's still a little bit mysterious. We don't know exactly why it works, but it seems to. And there's a question as to whether these drugs actually improve cognition. And while they certainly seem to improve cognition in patients that have ADD or ADHD, there's not much evidence that these particular drugs improve cognition in the average person. So this is a figure not from your book. And what it shows is that amphetamine can help, and this is in a very simple context. So it improves reaction time. If it's a simple task like pushing a button whenever a light comes on, it can make you quicker. So it can improve performance in that sense for a very simple task. But if you give someone a complex task that requires more sophisticated thought, increasing levels of amphetamine, increasing dosages, actually hurts performance. So it seems that amphetamine and related compounds can improve performance on simple tasks that really just about reaction time, but make performance worse for things that require complex thought. One thing that amphetamines also do is decrease appetite, and that was one of their original uses. Again, we're stimulating the fight or flight response, the sympathetic nervous system. One thing the sympathetic nervous system does is shut down digestion. And so these are used to depress appetite. They're used for weight loss. They've also historically been used as inhalers. So if you inhale the substance, it opens up the airways by activating the fight or flight response. So individuals with asthma historically were prescribed amphetamine to open up the airways. So these are all things that amphetamine was developed for. Some of these things it's still used for, some not. And a related drug is methamphetamine. So this is the chemical structure for methamphetamine. As you notice, very similar to amphetamine itself. It just has one little extra chemical group added on, so it has very similar effects. And methamphetamine is very rarely prescribed. There are very few conditions that methamphetamine is good for. One is narcolepsy that doesn't respond to typical medications, but that is very rare. Narcolepsy itself is rare, but certainly not responding to the typical narcolepsy medications is even rarer. Methamphetamine is directly toxic to dopamine neurons. It kills them. And that's something that amphetamine doesn't seem to do, but methamphetamine does. So dopamine neurons are killed by methamphetamine, so it damages the brain. And it has a number of side effects. Certainly things like anxiety, and that's common for people who become dependent on stimulants. One of the things that you also hear about is meth mouth, or you'll see ads like the one here showing how someone's physical appearance has degraded as a result of methamphetamine use. And this is a little bit not controversial. This definitely happens, but the question is why? And so it seems to be not so much the direct effect of methamphetamine, but the indirect effect. People that are addicted or dependent on methamphetamine and are heavy methamphetamine users tend not to engage in as much hygiene as they otherwise would. They might grind their teeth. And so the damage to gums that results in meth mouth might not be the direct effect of methamphetamine. It might be the sorts of behaviors that methamphetamine promotes, like teeth grinding, and also the fact that if you're on methamphetamine, you're not taking care of your oral hygiene, for example. So the effect definitely still occurs. The question is why. And methamphetamine has what are called precursors, chemicals that can be turned into methamphetamine. And these are now regulated. So some medications have switched their formulas so that they don't include these chemicals. Others are still available, but you need to, for example, provide a driver's license when you buy them. You don't need a prescription. They are what's called behind the counter. And that means that you can't buy a lot in one sitting. You need to provide identification so that if the records show this person has bought a lot of these precursors, that probably indicates they're manufacturing methamphetamine. They're not using it to treat a cold, for example. So now these precursors are regulated to a certain degree. Okay, switching gears to depressants. So this is a diagram from a different book, and we see the different categories of drugs here. So we've already covered nicotine, we've covered stimulants. Now we're going to look at the depressants. So the way depressants work is as GABA agonists. So we know GABA is our primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. By being an agonist for GABA, it increases GABA's effects. So you increase inhibition. And if we recall, inhibition is what we see here for these inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. And as I mentioned before, depressants refer not to one's mood, they refer to neural activity. So by enhancing GABA, you increase the frequency and the power of those IPSPs. It means that neurons will be less likely to fire. So you've got more inhibitory potentials. They are perhaps bigger. because GABA has been enhanced. And so you're decreasing neural activity by globally inhibiting the neurons in the brain. So what does this do for us? Well, one use of GABA agonists, depressants, is as what are called anxiolytics. So these are drugs that relax the person. They decrease anxiety. So anxiety often occurs from recurring thoughts, increased alertness, and so by decreasing neural activity overall, you can alleviate anxiety. And drugs that do that are called anxiolytics. You also have anticonvulsants. So drugs that prevent or decrease the severity of seizures. So if a person has epilepsy, they are often on an anticonvulsant. Anticonvulsants are depressants. So seizures start when you get sort of positive feedback within the nervous system. One neuron excites another, and that one excites another, and that one excites another. And it becomes a chain reaction. But if you decrease the overall level of neural excitability, that feedback process is much less likely to begin. So it's used to prevent seizures. Also drugs called hypnotics, which don't hypnotize you. That's what it sounds like. But they put you to sleep. That's what hypnotics do. So they are sleep aids. And depressants are also at a risk for dependence. Sleep aids are a commonly abused drug, but they also have these legitimate uses. One of the earliest, not the earliest, we'll see that one in a second, is alcohol. One of the earliest developed prescription drugs that fall into the depressant category are the barbiturates. And so these are drugs like phenobarbital, sodium pentothal, which you may have heard of. You also may not have heard of them because they're no longer in much use anymore. So barbiturate drugs were used as anxiolytics, as hypnotics early on, but it turns out they have a very narrow therapeutic range. The amount it takes to be effective is not that much less than the amount it takes to be lethal. And so barbiturate drugs were commonly overdosed on. And so there's since been a replacement, the benzodiazepines. These include drugs like diazepam, marketed as Valium, which you've probably heard of. Also things like Xanax. So these are benzodiazepine drugs. They are GABA agonists. So they have anxiolytic and hypnotic and anticonvulsant effects, but without the risk of fatal overdose or dependence that barbiturates have. There still is some risk, certainly, and we're increasingly aware of that risk, but you don't get as many fatal overdoses on benzodiazepines as on barbiturates. And the biggest depressant is alcohol. And we say alcohol, what we really mean is ethanol. Alcohol is a big group of chemical compounds. Ethyl alcohol, or ethanol, is what we usually mean when we say alcohol in a colloquial sense. We talk about drinking alcohol. What that person really means is ethanol. And ethanol is naturally occurring. It is the product of fermentation. So when certain organisms digest sugar, they excrete alcohol as a waste product. And animals, but certainly humans, have learned to take advantage of that process. So this is the molecule ethanol. It's a very little molecule, which is why it's been so hard to figure out exactly how ethanol works. So it has an effect on lots of different components of the body and the nervous system, but certainly it has an effect on GABA, which is why it's a depressant. And ethanol is okay in moderation. So there is a risk of dependence, but it is not as toxic, for example, as another alcohol, methanol, often called wood alcohol. And the reason I mentioned here is that alcohol has an interesting history, certainly in our country. We had Prohibition. And during Prohibition, it was illegal to create alcoholic beverages. And so people engaged in what was called bootlegging, illegal production of alcohol. And methanol often got mixed into that process, either accidentally or on purpose. Methanol is highly toxic. And this is why, when we say alcohol, what we really mean is ethanol, because methanol is an alcohol molecule. It just happens not to be the same that we typically drink, ethanol. So methanol can be lethal. It also preferentially damages the optic nerve, which can result in blindness. And this was a common occurrence during Prohibition. People would accidentally ingest methanol, thinking they were drinking ethanol, and they would lose their sight, or they would die. So that's just one alcohol molecule among many. But we'll focus on ethanol from now on. So what does ethanol do? Well, it's a GABA agonist, so it can act as an anxiolytic. It can relax the person. In higher doses, it can put them to sleep. It also acts as a glutamate antagonist. So glutamate is our most common neurotransmitter. It's our excitatory neurotransmitter. So you sort of get a double effect here. You increase GABA's effectiveness, so that's going to inhibit the nervous system. You also decrease glutamate's effectiveness. That's also going to inhibit the nervous system. Because we need glutamate to be working to form memories, it also explains why people can black out after alcohol use or during alcohol use. They don't form memories. So by eliminating the effect of glutamate, or at least decreasing it, you prevent memories from being formed. So you get effects like relaxation. You also get disinhibition. People have trouble controlling their impulses, whether it's an impulse to behave in a certain way or an emotional impulse. So your prefrontal cortex normally reins those impulses in. But alcohol shuts down the prefrontal cortex, and now you can no longer put on the brakes, so to speak, on those impulses. So you are disinhibited. It's a little counterintuitive. You would think that a depressant decreases neural activity. You should have fewer impulses. When in fact, you also lose the ability to inhibit the impulses that you do have. And this tends to happen at moderate doses of ethanol. So when someone has been drinking, they will become disinhibited for a while. If they continue drinking, they will exhibit drowsiness, loss of motor control, etc. So you lose balance. You also lose judgment. So both low-level effects, basic physical skills, and also higher cognition. So you lose the ability to move around and to speak, but also to make good decisions. So it has a variety of psychological effects. And it's one of the most commonly abused substances in the world. One of the forms that this abuse takes is in what's called fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS. So if a mother, while pregnant, ingests even a moderate amount of alcohol, there is a risk of fetal alcohol syndrome. And this produces developmental deficits, often mental retardation, but also some physical characteristics. The eyes tend to be smaller. The shape of the mouth and nose tend to be different. So you can spot fetal alcohol syndrome in terms of its effect on the body's shape. But again, also some cognitive deficits, and they can be quite severe. And of course, alcoholism is a common reason that an individual would drink alcohol during pregnancy. You see different formations in the brain, the loss of the corpus callosum. And this often occurs with heavy alcohol use, certainly. And of course, alcoholism itself has negative consequences, even outside the possible effects on a fetus. So the brain actually shrinks. You lose cortical volume, as we see here. However, that effect need not be permanent. You can have some permanent loss of memory and cognitive function, but as we see here in this diagram from your book, even after a couple months of not drinking anymore, the person recovers the volume that they've lost due to alcohol use. So their brain cells increase in volume again. Okay, another category, new category. So we've seen stimulants, we've seen depressants. Cannabis, also known as marijuana, another common drug, naturally occurring, has a long history. And its primary psychoactive ingredient is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. That's a long name, often just called THC, which is fine for our purposes. There are some other compounds as well, and they're getting an increasing level of notoriety in the news and in culture. You may have heard of CBD oil, cannabidiol. So there are other psychoactive compounds in marijuana. We'll focus on THC. You have cannabinoid receptors in your brain. They are metabotropic, and they're recently discovered. So it took a while to find these. Now, these receptors didn't evolve in order to respond to THC, which is exogenous. Your body does not make THC. And we didn't evolve these receptors just to respond to the contents of this plant. Endocannabinoids are molecules that look like THC that are native to the body. The body makes these. And of course, these came first. The reason that plants evolved this chemical, or this class of chemicals, is to take advantage of the receptors that animals already had. So endocannabinoids are molecules that activate cannabinoid receptors and are native to the body. And they have the effects that THC has. These receptors are also found in numerous places in the body. They're found in the spinal cord. They're found in the hippocampus, which is why THC can have an impact on memory. They're found in the basal ganglia. So we're not going to go into the individual effects of each of those regions when cannabinoids are introduced to the body. But the spinal cord, in particular, seems to mediate the cannabinoids' effect on pain. So cannabinoids decrease pain perception, we think, because of their activity in the spinal cord. They can also have an effect on memory because we think of their effect on the hippocampus. So what do they do? Well, one thing that cannabis or marijuana does is increase heart rate. It also increases appetite. But that increase in heart rate is why these don't count as depressants. We'll see they have a number of effects that are like the depressants, but they're distinct. Some sources will lump them in with the depressants. I think that's a mistake. Your book doesn't do it. We're not going to do it here. But cannabinoids will actually increase heart rate. You can get a sense of euphoria with sufficient dosage and relaxation. So a combination of stimulant and depressant effects that we've already seen. At high doses, you can get hallucinations, and we'll see that hallucination is used in a loose sense here when we get to the hallucinogens. This is rarer to modify one's sensory perception, but that is possible. And of course, marijuana is increasingly in our awareness because of trends in decriminalization, trends in even legalization, and an increasing amount of research for its effects on things like appetite and its effects on pain. So as an additive to chemotherapy, for example. Chemotherapy tends to decrease appetite. Cancer, of course, is associated with a high level of pain. And so medical marijuana has been promoted to increase appetite so that individuals under chemotherapy can continue eating. They'll have an appetite, keep their strength up, and also to decrease the pain they experience. So some potential interesting medical uses. There are also some potential applications, not so much for THC as for other psychoactive compounds in marijuana, for seizures. Certain seizure disorders, not the most common ones, but certain seizure disorders seem to respond to these drugs. And so some new potential avenues for the compounds found in marijuana. And as I mentioned, analgesia is one of these potential avenues, a decrease in pain perception. So it's true for cancer, it's true for other conditions as well, that marijuana, through, we think, the spinal cord mechanism, seems to decrease pain perception. It's an important possible application for these drugs. Another class of drugs are the psychotherapeutics, so drugs that are used to alleviate psychological disorders. We don't have time to go into all of them. I'll mention a couple of examples here, particularly as they relate to the disorder of depression. Toward the end of the course, we'll talk about schizophrenia, and we'll see a couple more kinds of psychotherapeutic drugs. But for now, the first antidepressants were the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So as the name suggests, they inhibit monoamine oxidase, which is an enzyme. We see it here in this diagram from your book. These little boomerangs that are attached to a mitochondrion in the presynaptic neuron. So they break down the monoamine neurotransmitters. We'll see what those are in a minute. That term is not important. But the drugs, the antidepressants, inhibit monoamine oxidase. So they prevent the breakdown of these neurotransmitters. It elevates the levels of these neurotransmitters. So which neurotransmitters? Serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, and epinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline, So it elevates the levels of all of these. Because of its effect on serotonin, it elevates mood, which is why it helps with depression. But you get a lot of side effects because of all these other neurotransmitters that it affects. So the next generation was more specific, the tricyclics. They're named that because of this three-ring structure. But you have serotonin and norepinephrine. So now it's more specific, and that's one of the trends in drug development, trying to get as specific as you can so you get the effect you want with fewer side effects. And tricyclics affect the transporter molecules. They affect reuptake. So by inhibiting reuptake, you keep serotonin and norepinephrine out in the cleft for longer, so they are agonists. And the current generation of antidepressants are the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs for short. And these also inhibit reuptake, but just for serotonin, so it's far more specific. And it doesn't alleviate all the symptoms of depression, but for many people, it alleviates a lot of them. A related disorder is called bipolar disorder. You've probably heard of it. It has components of depression, but it also has components of what are called manias. And so these are episodes in which the person is very excitable. They engage in sort of the opposite behaviors that you do with depression. So you have very little sleep behavior with mania, whereas depression is often characterized by increased sleep. And so you have two sort of opposite effects. And so the antidepressants often work for the depression symptoms. They can exacerbate, they can make the mania symptoms worse. So you have special drugs for bipolar disorder, and one of them, the famous one, is lithium. And so lithium works in the postsynaptic neuron. Its mechanism is not entirely understood, but it seems to alleviate some of the symptoms of bipolar disorder. So a different psychotherapeutic drug. Okay, so we've covered nicotine, we've covered the stimulants, the depressants, marijuana, psychotherapeutics. Our next to last category is the opioids. These are sometimes mistakenly referred to as opiates. Opiates are chemicals that are literally made in the opium poppy, the flower that we see here. This is the naturally occurring source for drugs like morphine. So the opiates are naturally occurring, but they don't include all of the drugs that we're about to talk about. If you've heard of the opioid crisis, all opiates are opioids. Opioids is the umbrella term. So the opiates are the ones that literally come from the opium poppy. These are drugs like morphine and codeine, which you've probably heard of. But opioids include other naturally occurring compounds, but also synthetic compounds, like heroin. You've almost certainly heard of heroin. You may not have heard of methadone, but here we see a bottle of heroin solution. Heroin, the reason I capitalized it here, heroin is a brand name. It was developed by the Bayer Company, the same people that make aspirin now. They don't like to publicize the fact that heroin is a brand name, that they made it, because it's now an illicit drug. We know how dangerous it can be. But heroin is an opioid. It is synthetic, so it is not an opiate, but it is an opioid. So there are opioid receptors in your brain and your body. These are metabotropic. There are 3 kinds of metabotropic receptors. We're not going to go into the details there. But these receptors aren't there to bind to morphine or heroin or any of these other compounds that the body doesn't make. They bind to endogenous opioids. So there are compounds that your body makes that bind to these receptors and do things like reduce pain perception. So what's really happening here is that the opioid drugs are mimicking these chemicals that your body makes in small concentrations. And part of the brain called the para-aqueductal gray, which the neuroanatomy is not particularly important, but it is a portion of gray matter that surrounds effectively what is one of the ventricles of the brain, called the aqueduct, and it is heavily involved in pain perception. And one of the main things that opioids do is analgesia, sort of like marijuana in certain doses. But that's the main purpose of the opioids, is to reduce pain perception. So they produce analgesia. And that is what they're typically prescribed for, and many opioids are prescribed. So the opioid crisis refers to certainly recreational use, but also substance abuse due to prescription. So people can get hooked on opioids even if they start with a legitimate prescription for things like chronic pain. So analgesia and pain are a big issue in society. How are we supposed to address these things? Historically, it's with opioids, but we're starting to see some of the negative impact that opioids can have on society. And a little bit of history, interesting history. So there have been 2 wars called the Opium Wars. And so what these were a war between primarily Britain and China. We in France were unfortunately involved in this as well. But China was starting to see an increase in opium use, wanted to crack down on it, so banned opium. But that left Britain with nothing to trade. Britain was growing opium in India, wanted to trade it to China for things like porcelain, things that Britain wanted. But China banned the substance. So Britain literally went to war with China to secure the right to continue selling opium to Chinese merchants. So they fought a war. Britain won. So Britain got to keep on selling opium to the Chinese. Hong Kong used to be a British colony. They took it from China as one of the concessions from these opium wars. So a little bit of history. So we know from the war on drugs that drugs are a powerful economic force, but they have literally started wars. So a little bit of interesting history there. Our final group, we've already covered the opioids, now we'll cover the hallucinogens. And hallucinogens alter sensory perception. They do not, as we'll see, literally create hallucinations. Hallucinations are perceived stimuli that are not actually there at all. What hallucinogens do is alter our sensory perception. So they take things that are actually out there and modify them. So they may add colors, they may make them more vivid, may make them appear to move. But they don't generally make things appear out of whole cloth, out of nothing. And hallucinogens tend to alter visual perception. When we get to our unit on schizophrenia, we'll see that you can have auditory hallucinations as well, but here it's mainly visual. And hallucinogens are often naturally occurring, not all of them are, but they have a long history of use. And what they typically do is activate special serotonin receptors. They're called 5-HT2A receptors. So they're a particular kind of serotonin receptor, and they're found in visual cortex. And that's why hallucinogens affect visual perception, is because they're affecting receptors, activating receptors in visual cortex. So what do? Well, we've already seen that they produce hallucinations. This figure from your book shows how, as a hallucinogen takes effect, it alters visual perception. So this figure is an artist's rendering of what they're seeing. They're actually looking at a person. But as the hallucinogen becomes active and more concentrated in the body, that perception is more and more altered. So again, these are often referred to as hallucinations. They are not, strictly speaking, hallucinations. Because hallucinogens are so specific, they tend to carry a very low risk of overdose. Most of these compounds, it is more or less impossible to overdose on. Also, a low risk of dependence. And again, we think this is because they don't really interact with the dopamine system very much. So there really aren't reported cases of physiological or even psychological addiction to most hallucinogens. And for a while, they were stigmatized, mainly because of the counterculture movements of the 60s. But there are some possible applications we're becoming aware of. Treatment for certain psychological disorders, things like post-traumatic stress disorder. Also, what we call palliative care. People that have terminal diseases often experience depression, anxiety, and there's some research suggesting that moderate dosages of hallucinogens, certain hallucinogens, can alleviate those effects. So some possible hallucinogens. So what are some common ones? Well, perhaps the most famous is a synthetic one called lysergic acid diethylamide, or just LSD, often just called acid. So up here we have a colorful portrait of the developer of LSD, an individual named Hoffman. There's also mescaline, which is found in the peyote cactus, so this is naturally occurring. It occurs in southwestern North America, and It has historically been used by Native American tribes in some of their religious practices. Psilocybin, often found in what are called magic mushrooms. There, of course, is nothing magic about them. They just contain this drug, psilocybin, that has similar effects to mescaline and LSD. There's also a special class of hallucinogens called the dissociatives. They're called that because they not only modify perception, they also give one a sense of being dissociated from one's body. They can produce sort of an out-of-body experience. Historically, these have been used as part of general anesthesia. And these are drugs like PCP and ketamine, which you may have heard of. These work a little bit differently. So LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, these primarily work through the serotonin system. Dissociatives antagonize glutamate. So here, a diagram not from your book, you see a special site on one of the glutamate receptors, the NMDA receptor, for PCP. So that's the site where PCP binds, and it inhibits this glutamate receptor. So it has an effect on pain. It reduces pain perception. It also inhibits memory formation. So one of the interesting effects of dissociatives is they inhibit memory, and they may not really alleviate that much pain during surgery, but they could dissociate one from one's sense of one's own body, so one is in some way distanced from the pain, and you also won't remember it because it inhibits memory. So it may not have an effect on pain the way opioids do, but may still be useful as anesthetics because they sort of solve the pain problem in a slightly different way. What's also interesting is that high doses of these substances can imitate the symptoms of schizophrenia. You get symptoms of psychosis. So you start to get paranoia. You get auditory hallucinations, voices that aren't actually there. And so this has led to some interesting hypotheses about what schizophrenia is. When we get to that unit, we'll talk more about this, but this is sort of a preview that psychoactive drugs like PCP and ketamine produce some of the symptoms of schizophrenia, and so the interest is whether they're illuminating a mechanism by which schizophrenia works. One other hallucinogen that I'll pick out and sort of single out here is MDMA, often called ecstasy. And it's actually structurally quite heavily related to methamphetamine. It is often categorized as a hallucinogen, but it also has some stimulant properties as well. It's sort of in between. MDMA also activates serotonin receptors, so it modifies visual perception. But it also has an effect on dopamine and norepinephrine receptors. So it has some combination effects between hallucinogen and stimulant. But here we're categorizing it as a hallucinogen. You get some euphoria, you get increased arousal. You also get increased levels of certain hormones, like oxytocin, which is why MDMA, we think, increases sociability. People seek out social interaction. They seek out physical contact from other people. We think because of the release of these hormones. So MDMA has a lot of effects. So you have euphoria, that sort of good feeling. Also sociability. People seek out social contact. There's been some recent research on MDMA. So long-term effects on behavior are a little bit controversial. We don't know exactly if MDMA has serious long-term effects. There is the possibility of long-term depression because it turns out that MDMA kills serotonin neurons. It usually takes a pretty high dose. This is a figure not from your book, but you see a lot fewer serotonin neurons on the right than on the left. And that's because high doses of MDMA can be lethal for serotonin neurons. Not usually in the dosages that human beings ingest, but it is possible. For a while, we thought that MDMA was also toxic for the dopamine system. It turns out it's not. So some researchers found the dopamine neurons died when they applied MDMA to the brain, but it turns out the drug they were getting was mislabeled by the company, and they were actually applying methamphetamine. So we already know methamphetamine kills dopamine neurons. MDMA, as far as we know, does not. So this was a sort of a case of mistaken identity, and this happened. So this paper came out saying, hey, MDMA kills dopamine neurons, and they had to write to the journal and say, hey, sorry, we made a mistake, take it back. And so they had to retract this paper, saying instead that no, we applied the wrong drug, MDMA does not seem to kill dopamine neurons, as far as we know. Okay, that will do it for our unit on individual psychoactive drugs. So we've seen these different categories: stimulants, depressants, psychotherapeutics, hallucinogens, opioids, marijuana, hallucinogens. And we see that some of the common neurotransmitters that are affected are things like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, neurotransmitters we've been talking about for most of the course. And so it makes sense now what these drugs do because of the neurotransmitters they affect. We've seen the effects that these drugs can have. Things like risk of dependence, especially when it comes to dopamine. Effects on alertness when it comes to norepinephrine. Effects on vision because of serotonin. And so we can link the effect that a drug has to the neurotransmitter that it affects. We've also talked a little bit about history, especially for those naturally occurring compounds, like opium, like alcohol, like marijuana, and also trends in usage. So alcohol, very common drug of abuse. We've seen historical trends for things like cocaine. And so time will tell what sort of continued usage patterns we see. Obviously, marijuana, increasingly decriminalized. Marijuana use is on the rise, not surprisingly. So we'll keep an eye on this, but now you know how these drugs have their effect, what some of the risks and benefits are. And so now you're hopefully in a better position to understand what place drugs have in society, both legitimate and illegitimate uses. Okay, so for next time, be sure to take the online quiz, as always, for this lecture. And for next time, we'll do this virtual lab experiment. So here's the link. I'll also send it out. So participate in this lab experiment. It's fun. So take notes. You'll see this experiment also happens to involve cocaine. So we'll see what cocaine does to the brain and behavior. So do that lab experiment in time for next time. And just as a heads up, exam 2 is on the horizon. So studying early is always better than waiting to the last minute. So keep that in mind as well.